Hi, we're talking about pigments and the colorants that are used in our paints. So while I talk about the pigments, I'll get you to fill in the colors on this sheet and then we'll move on to the color wheels. And you do that with just the colors that you've got here. So for instance, with the inorganic colors, they will be the yellow oxide, red oxide, ultra blue, you might have some other earth colours. So just paint them out in the square. And with the modernist palette or the organic pigments, you might have phthalo blue, naphthol scarlet, yellow light Hansa, yellow mid-azo, Prussian blue, but they will actually seem a bit brighter, but we'll get to that. So it'll be the colours that aren't the inorganic colours, and just paint a couple of those out. You will notice some differences and we'll get to those as we talk about them. So for the most part, when we talk about the pigments that we're using here, you'll find them in watercolours, oils and acrylics, nearly all the way through, 99% of them. Good quality pigments, as we've discussed before, are those which are light fast. In other words, they won't fade when they're exposed to light, or indeed, if they interact with anything out of the air, they won't have any sort of chemical reaction. They'll remain inert. So it's handy to classify, as we as humans tend to do, everything. And when we talk about pigments, we have classifications of inorganic and organic. Now, organic doesn't mean that they're dug up out of the ground or they haven't had fertilizer or pesticide used. It's actually an expression that's used in chemistry to denote that the chemical makeup of the compound we're talking about has carbon, oxygen and hydrogen chains or bonds in it, and that's called organic chemistry. So those pigments are called organic pigments, those that are made up with those carbon, oxygen, hydrogen bonds or chains. Conversely, we have inorganic pigments which are not made with those. Doesn't mean to say they won't have carbon, oxygen or hydrogen in them, just not those chain and ring bonds that you find in organic chemistry. So inorganic pigments, almost counterintuitively, tend to be those ones that are dug up out of the ground. So oxides, iron oxides such as yellow ochre or yellow oxide, red ochre, azurite, blue, not found as much, but certainly lapis, which has the same chemical makeup as ultramarine blue, it's the same chemistry. But generally the more muted tones tend to be those inorganic colours. So something you will notice, and we'll talk about this more when we get to our colour wheels, but the inorganic colours, by and large, and it's always a generalisation, but by and large have larger pigment particle size, which sometimes, but not always, gives rise to being more opaque. And I mean more opaque than the organic colours. And the inorganics were the colours that had been used literally for millennia. We're going to move on to the Old Masters palette, and we call it that just to give it a name, but it does tend to reflect the sort of colours the Old Masters would have had at their disposal at the time. There were other colours, obviously, but these are basically the sort of colours they were using, and that would be a red ochre or oxide, a yellow ochre for yellow, an ultra blue, very expensive back a few hundred years ago, not nearly as expensive now because it can be made chemically mixed rather than having to be dug up and processed quite heavily. But these three colours used as primaries will give us this colour wheel. So the way to do this, put down a blob about the size of a 5-cent piece, about half an inch or 10 millimetres across, of ultra blue, yellow oxide, red oxide. Lay that out. mix that first between each one. Wash your brush each time. I would tend to take the lighter colour to the darker colour. What I mean by light to dark is here the yellow oxide is obviously the lightest colour. Take that, so when you're brushing, literally brush that towards the blue and just take a little bit of blue. The same the other way around. The yellow oxide is lighter than the red oxide, so move the yellow oxide with a clean brush towards the red oxide, just picking a little bit up, then mixing it back like that. If you do it the other way around, the blue, you take the blue all the way through, the blue is going to be more powerful. The ultra blue will be more powerful in this situation than the yellow oxide, and so you'll tend to end up with sort of blue halfway around and then dark green and miss a whole lot of the other colours. While that's still all wet, so use enough colour, put a good amount of colour on. You then want to take the white and just put little dabs of white, tiny, just 3 millimeters across, I guess. And while that's still wet, you can use your finger or use your brush, but wash the brush each time, just to mix it in with that colour that's right there on the circle. And that way you'll see the undertone. And that's a big thing. The undertone is quite different quite often to the mass tone or the top tone. So continue on doing that and we'll have a bit of a chat about the actual colours. So as we talked about before, basically all three of these colours would have been dug up out of the ground. Nowadays, certainly iron oxides, the yellow oxide, the red oxide, raw siennas, burnt siennas, those sort of earth colours are still quite often dug up, but they're cleaned. We wash them to get rid of any soluble particles, or the manufacturer does at least. When we've made colours, pigments from Arnhem Land that we've been sent down, we've had to do that. We've had to actually crush the rocks and then wash them and then sieve them for the particle size, grind them to get them to the right particle size. So there's quite a lot of work in doing that. And when it comes to the original lapis, aside from it being very rare, when they did find it, they then had to crush it and wash it to get rid of the soluble parts and wash it again and knead it quite a few times to the point where they were left with not very much concentrated pigment. And I've actually got some original lapis and it's nowhere near as strong as the ultra blue that we buy in bags. And this is chemically manufactured pigment. It's much more intense, much stronger. The reason we call it the Old Masters palette is more just for the colours. As we said, they're quite subdued. If you look at a lot of the Old Masters work, there's two things here. Even though they'll have bright sunrises or sunsets or highlights on clothes, when you actually look at it, they're not using really bright colours. Those colours are still these colours, but in context. The other thing is, back in the day, they didn't have bright red front doors or post boxes, so they didn't have to try and describe those colours. There weren't a lot of bright colours around. So hopefully you end up with something that looks a bit like one of these. If you're not finished yet, just hit pause and come back to us and we'll start on the next one. So we're finished with the Old Masters palette. We're talking about organic chemistry or organic colours. We separate the colours out from a chemical perspective, probably because that's the easiest way to do it. How much bearing does that have for us as artists? Probably not a lot, but it's interesting just maybe from a historical point of view of the inorganic colours. And there is a difference, as we described before. They're a bit more opaque, they tend to be more subtle, maybe not quite as strong. When you look at the organic colours, once again, it's just the chemistry, organic, but they tend to be really quite punchy colours, bright and very intense. You look at phthalo blue, for instance, and it will just overrun just about any other colour. So, back into this again. you're going to mix up a colour wheel, something like these ones I have here. And I'll get you to do the same as you did last time. Some yellow, the phthalo blue out, and whichever are the reds, naphtha, scarlet, or there's a whole lot you can use. In here, taking the lightest colour to the darker one. So the yellow, most definitely when you're mixing it with phthalo blue, the phthalo blue is like 10 times stronger than any of the yellows. So definitely paint the yellow out, plenty of yellow, and then just touch the phthalo blue and start mixing it back, okay? And the same thing all the way around. Keep doing it fairly quickly, and then we're going to do our little dabs of white. And while everything's still wet, mix those so you can see the undertone. We talked about that briefly before, but we talk about mass tone, and that's when the colour is at its strongest. And when you look at colours like dioxin purple or even phthalo blue, actually straight out, the mass tone, it looks almost black. We mix it with white, and that's where we get the delicious undertones. And that's especially pertinent with a lot of these organic colours. So straight up, when we're comparing the two palettes, you can see straight away the strength and the intensity and the brilliance of the modernist palette, or these organic colours. And we know in art history, we've been told many times that the Fauvist, the modernist, the impressionist, any of those movements that came after these colours were developed wouldn't have happened without the development of these colours. Trying to get those punchy landscapes or cityscapes just wouldn't be possible, wasn't going to be possible with this limited, really quite subtle palette. Okay, so to finish up, we've learnt about inorganic and organic pigments. I guess the other thing to note with the particle size, inorganic being bigger, organic being much finer generally, as a general rule, that can also lead to some difference when mixing them. Once they dry, if you're mixing them literally on your palette or on a canvas, really doesn't make that much difference. But certainly if you mix up a batch of colour for yourself and then leave it and you're hanging on to it, you will find quite often that the inorganic and organic pigments don't necessarily want to stay together. As I say, once they're dry, not a problem because they have nowhere to go. But their surface tension and the difference between their particle sizes therefore make them not really want to stay together. They tend to push apart, and so the colours might separate out. You might have a nice blended colour mixed up and you're going to use it on another picture, and you come back a couple of weeks later and find that separated. That's fine, it'll mix back in, and as I say, once you get it down on your substrate and it dries, there'll be no issues. It's just in that interim period when it's in the wet paint, it might want to separate a bit. So that's one reason to know the difference between organic and inorganic. So when we're talking about colour, and we talk about warm colours and cool colours, probably the best example is this picture of a barn where we start here, autumn colours, there's more oranges in there and a quite subdued, moving into cooler colours. And of course our whites have become more blue than white, or at least have a slight blue tinge to give that real cool feeling. And then moving on to spring, where there's more greenery, as you'd expect in spring, and the colours are starting to warm up a little bit more. And then moving through to summer, this slide is probably a bit exaggerated, but you've got those yellows that have overtaken the green. This picture, it does look like midsummer somewhere in Australia potentially. The same picture all the way through, but just with different treatments of colour and colour temperature. So if we're trying to get, for instance, a warm summer feel, you can use those more subtle, inorganic colours that the old masters used, which will give much more warmth. But you can still use, obviously, some organic colours in there, some more yellows to get that hot summer feel, versus moving towards winter. You could certainly still use ultra blue, but you would tend to use phthalo blue and maybe more of those organic colours that are stronger and more intense. So having touched on a bit of colour mixing, do a little bit of your own research and most definitely try mixing up just 3 colours, but try changing those 3 colours up. It is amazing the resulting mixtures you can get.